Here we look at the practicalities of sending letters in a time before envelopes, postage stamps and a centralised mail service. Research Associate Dr. Jim Caudle and Dr. Jim Grant, an expert on the 18th century post, explain how Burns reached his correspondence.
I want to start out initially asking about letter wrappers, because that's the technical terminology. These are facsimiles, these are not the real things. But how are these different? Here's some prefabricated envelopes of the sort we're all used to, or used to be used to. And how are these wrappers different from the ones we have today? Because a lot of this looks like origami or paper airplanes that you have to fold it. This one you have to fold and then refold and seal. This is a simpler fold. You just fold it over the one time. You complete it with some sort of glue work, adhesive wafers and sealing wax. And were there guides to how to do this, or did people simply learn this from watching other people muck around? And how do these things even stay together? Because I see these and I think this would not hold up in the post today.
Well, it goes back. It goes back a while. I mean, if you really want to go back, the Sumerians actually had little envelopes made out of clay, and they put little things into these and passed them around, usually between accountancy individuals, and so they go back 3,000 years. In terms of practicalities in this country, you really got to go back to the beginning of the 19th century, when people who had some wealth, they folded paper into diamond shapes usually, and they sealed them with either sealing wax or wafers, as you talk about, and used them for invitations. And they would send them to friends to invite them to balls or whatever. But it was a pretty marginal type activity. They did this because essentially the price of paper was expensive, and the ordinary guy who was sending letters was not going to faff around by doing this sort of thing. He essentially knew that he was going to be charged for the number of sheets that he actually sent through the general post, and therefore his whole raison d'etre when he sent a letter was to minimize the charge, because essentially he knew that his recipient was going to have to pay for that piece of paper. And his what he did was that he wrote on one side of his paper the address, and he would fold it. There was no regulations about folding. There was no guidance to folding, but usually it was done so that the ends came together behind the in a simple way, and some sealing wax could be applied, and it was sent to the local receiving office, where the postmaster would put the charges on that sheet of paper which was so wrapped, and the individual would write his message on the obverse, i.e. the opposite side to the address. And if he had a lot to say, he would also write it on the address side, so that he got as much information on the single sheet of paper as he could, because he knew that was the charge. And that's why that's why paper sellers actually sold large sheets of paper. And Burns, actually, there's some one or two nice quotes, Burns, especially to Mrs. Dunlop, saying that I went to the paper seller in Dumfries and I got the largest sheet I could possibly get.
And that's what them relaying newsprint size. And just going with that, it's newsprint size.
Well, no,
like folio size paper.
You didn't get newsprint size. I don't think you got elephant folio size, but you got pretty big sheets. And
they're clearly pushing the boundaries on the.
They pushed the boundaries as much, because they could not put an enclosure in, because if they put an enclosure in, that was going to cost you double. And the post office had a right to open any wrapper to see whether there was an enclosure inside.
And that's a nice excuse for spying as well. It's like, we just had to count what the sheets were.
Absolutely.
This happens to be they read it along the way.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
And I think I would be correct to say that the wrapper is the part of the letter from that time period, 1750 to 1800 roughly, that's the least likely part to survive. So if you bought a letter today, you wouldn't, and even if it is, you might see it ignored in an edition. The Burns letters have usually paid attention to that. The Boswell editions paid attention to that. And so, but often that is, if there's going to be something in the letter that's left out by a good editor, it's probably going to be that kind of evidence. And sometimes when these letters are scanned, they can leave that out. So why do you think that this part of the letter, unless it has writing on it, and you've pointed out that often it does because someone's thinking, I got to get my money's worth out of this sheet. It's going to be paid for. Yeah. And so, but for many of these letters, it's our only clues to a lot of the time and place of the letter. But if it's somehow discarded, recycled, as you point out, people, it's a paper poor society. So people are trying to use this paper as much as they can.
Yeah, and that's right. And from the postal historian's point of view, that's a great sadness that these wrappers were discarded. And so the information in terms of when they were sent, how they were sent, has been lost. And so the detective work that you might be able to do on a well annotated wrapper is just not there. And from my own, audit of the letters that are available from Burns, they are very few actually wrappers that have been kept and scanned into the archive, and therefore you are struggling. The regulations changed in 1784, though. The Postal Acts, there was a lot of Postal Acts in the 19th century, and the regulations changed. And so the weight of the letter became important after 1784. So this did affect Burns's later correspondence. So basically, after 1784, letters below an ounce were charged at a rate, right, between the main postal towns, mainly Edinburgh. A treble rate was charged for the number of sheets that were in that wrapper, right? Above an ounce, a single rate was charged for every quarter ounce that was added on. So the rate became quite complex, but the sheets became less important than actually the weight. And so
they figured it out that people are scamming them on that.
Absolutely. And so there was this absolute need to try and keep ahead of the scammers, the paper scammers. And of course, Burns hated the Postal Service because of the costs, and he would work hard to actually get round this. And of course, there was other ways to get round it, using carriers and the like. But in terms of the paper costs, this was another issue. But alas, we don't have all the wrappers, so we don't have all that postal information that would be quite fascinating in many cases.
Can we talk about the three elements? There may be more than three, but the ones that I expect to look for are, we see this example, we've got a place of sending, and then we've got the date there. And then on the other side, the one that's most likely to be unreadable is the number, right?
Right. Okay, let's just start at the beginning. In terms of the name stamp, the hand name stamp. Hand name stamps were introduced in Scotland in the 1740s. Before that, there was manuscript marks, which tend to be put on recto as a discharge mark. Though some people would argue they were also an accountancy mark, but that's technical. The circular mark is what's called an Edinburgh Bishop mark. Now, Henry Bishop was the postmaster in London in the 1660s, and he introduced a mark which essentially was the day and the date. And all mail out of London from 1661 was in fact marked with a circular day and month stamp, not the year, just the date and the month. In 1693, that was introduced in Edinburgh. And so all mail going to London from 1693 had these marks, a date and a month stamp on. But it was the late 1750s before, in fact, it was on all mail through Edinburgh. So the letters of Burns usually have that Edinburgh bishop mark on them. The date, the year, wasn't applied until 1801, so there'll be no letters of Burns with that, with the year on it. The actual town name stamp that we are interested in is a fascinating mark, because name stamps were constructed out of usually boxwood. They were cut by the local postmaster, and they were dipped in lamp black and linseed oil, and they were stamped as a discharge mark on the obverse of the wrapper to indicate the postal town from which they were sent. But they didn't last long. They were fragile. They broke. And so and we know that, for instance, let's just take Dumfries, because Dumfries was Burns's main postal town. In the 1790s, there are 4 different hand stamps known of Dumfries in the 1790s, simply because they didn't last. And the amount of letters they were applied to increased year on year. And so it's a very interesting study. You can actually tell from the size and the shape of the hand stamp almost to the year when it was actually used. On recto, on these wrappers, you will get a address. You will often get some sort of inscription, sometimes in the bottom left-hand corner, if it's with a parcel, etc. Sometimes it's gone with a carrier. But if it hasn't gone with a carrier and it's gone with the general post, then you will get a number. Now, that number indicates the rate. And the rates, of course, are fascinating. If you have up to 1784, for anything that was sent up to 80 miles, it was tuppence in Scotland. After 1784, it was a penny for a single sheet under an ounce. Anything more than that, of course, was charged double, triple, and quadruple, etc., depending on the number of sheets and also on the weight. So you can tell from the rate often the distance. You can also tell from the number of sheets as well. And you often will find that rates are scored out. For instance, a letter that went from Dumfries to Edinburgh and then beyond Edinburgh would have 2 rate marks. The first one would be scored out because that would be the rate from Dumfries to Edinburgh, and then an additional rate would be applied in Edinburgh from, say, if it was going on to Haddington or wherever, another rate would be charged there, and the accumulative rate would be the final rate that would be on the letter. So you can tell a lot from the rates about the size of the letter, the number of enclosures, etc.
And then the shock experience by the recipient when they get a letter full of enclosures. Someone sent them an extra poem and some extra notes, and then they suddenly have to pay all the money.
And they went to the receiving office and they saw that this large package and it was going to cost them maybe 8 pence or a shilling, and simply they didn't actually pick it up. And that's where you got dead letters. And the post office by 1800 was probably had several 100,000 dead letters in Edinburgh a year because people just were not going to pay for them.
And do we know what happened? Did they eventually get incinerated or something?
They were essentially eventually just burnt. Much to the sadness of the postal historian.
Yeah, so they do try to use every bit of the paper. I think we can get
yes, and they tried to
one of the letters where someone's writing, and anywhere that's not on the part for the address has got extra writing on it. So they're going to really try to make the most of that.
And there's letters known that were reused, where essentially the letter had a sheet where had one side not used, and it was filled in again, and it was written again, and it was put back in the post.
And you can even do crisscrosses.
Yes,
I've never seen
absolutely.
those in the Burns material or the Boswell
Absolutely.
material, but you can do
Absolutely.
crisscrosses. And finally, since we're dealing with an era known in the very old history books as old corruption, term wouldn't be used much now. We see in a lot of these letters the use of a franc. There we go.
Yes.
And so we've got this says to Mr. Robert Burns in Mauchline, but then it says free W. Kerr. And that sounds like a political slogan to get someone who's innocent out of jail. You know, we've got to free W. Kerr, but it actually indicates a person who's got a franking privilege to send the letter without putting postage, and they're either members of parliament or they work for the postal service.
Well, I mean, the franking privilege was, you know, initiated in the middle of the 17th century as a means of basically allowing members of parliament to, you know, communicate with their constituents, and because they weren't paid, it was felt reasonable that they didn't have to pay for correspondence. So they got a franking privilege. It comes from an old French word meaning free, essentially, but it was extended. It was extended to members of the government. Then it was extended to military senior officers, colonial administrators, and the list actually got longer and longer, and the abuses got greater and greater, and the Treasury lost more and more money. It was particularly important to get francs, if you could, from post office officials, because essentially post office officials were not held to the change of regulation in 1784, where in 1784, basically francs had to be addressed by the frankee and dated by the frankee. And actually, there was some regulation which said actually they should be even in the vicinity of the post office, which they were actually set, the franc was actually sent from. But post office officials were exempt from all that. They were also exempt from the local penny postage charges, which basically, even if you had a free franc, you had to pay the penny postage charges. So francs from people like William Kerr, Secretary of the Post Office at the end of the 18th century, were especially valuable. And that's why I think Mrs. Dunlop obviously was keen to get a hold of a pile of William Kerr francs, because he was the secretary in Edinburgh and his francs were gold. You know, they didn't cost anything, and they could be used in a very, shall we say, free way with little sanction. I mean, there was little sanction anyway on francs. I mean, if you were a, you know, if you breached the privilege, there was regulations that said you should be charged double or even triple, but that rarely happened. And there's very few examples in postal history where you can actually find letters which have been surcharged because of breach of privilege. They usually were just charged the actual rate that they should have been charged.
Well, that's great. I think that's all the time we have, sadly, but thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this. We could have kept talking about this for quite a while, but we got the basics. We've got through the basics of this and some of the intricacies of postage and letters in Burns's time. So